everyone, and welcome to today's Kneat webinar, Achieving Computer Software Assurance, CSA, with Digital Validation. Before we get started, and just to allow some time for people to slowly get into the system today, I just want to go through some housekeeping items. We do recommend that you use earphones or headset to listen to the event. We find it's the best audio quality. You will be muted during this presentation. However, we do encourage you to ask questions. You can do so by typing them into that question panel box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll try and get to as many of them as possible at the end. We do have a long presentation today with lots of information, so if we do run out of time or don't get to your question, we will make sure to follow up with you directly. This presentation is being recorded, and so an email will be sent out early next week that you will get a copy of both the recording and the slides that you can reference. However, if any other questions come up or you need more information, always feel free to contact us at info@kneat.com. And if there's any feedback during the survey or during the webinar, please feel free to send us a note. With that, I'm going to go to the next slide and welcome our presenter. As mentioned, I said we're looking at achieving computer software assurance with digital validation, and we have our subject matter expert on the topic, Darren Geaney, presenting. And so Darren, I'll pass it to you to take on with the presentation.
Thanks very much, Madison. Thanks very much for your kind introduction. Just to echo what Madison said, you're all very welcome to this webinar. We'll go through this webinar. We have an hour's time. We may or may not get to questions at the end, but thanks again for your attendance, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedules to come and attend this particular webinar. So I'll just move on to the next slide here. Again, so the title of this webinar is Achieving Computer Software Assurance CSA with Digital Validation. So again, this is just a cover slide here. So we'll go on to the next one where explain a bit more about ourselves. So again, this is just a copyright and disclaimer statement that we do for all webinars. It's just something to keep in mind when we actually do it. Today's speaker, that's me. My name is Darren Geaney. I'm a process engineer with Kneat. My own personal experience is I've got 25 years experience in the software development and software quality side of life, in relation to initially starting off with the telecoms industry as a software designer, pushing on to a software tester and quality engineer in the telecoms industry, then moving on to the medical device industry where I was a validation engineer, and then for several years was a senior software quality assurance engineer with a major manufacturing major manufacturer in the west of Ireland. I moved on then to a smaller company, which again brought me into different realms of computer software validation in terms of devices, end-to-end, ensuring end-to-end compatibility with data, etc. So that's just a brief history of me. So what we're going to discuss today, so we just got 10 points in the agenda today, so we'll go through each of them. So the first one is, what do you need to know about CSA? It's just going to be a very high overview of what computer software assurance is. All right, we'll go through some of the common pain points. Sorry about that, it's not pained points, we're not painting anyone here. So some of the common pain points that we have. We'll talk then about what we all know to be the traditional validation approach, how we currently do things and how we have evolved over time in terms of going from paper to going into an online digitization process, which is what Kneat provides. And we'll talk through that as well. We'll then talk through the CSA guidance, the benefits and the intended use of, taking this new CSA approach. Why have we changed? Why did globally people see the need for change to come away from the traditional CSV approach? We looked then at some of the feature risks and some of how we actually look at features, how we assess features, how we assess systems, how do we define which part of the system is high risk, which part of the system is low risk. And again, we'll kind of talk at a very high level through that. We'll then talk through about, right, I'm going to look at the particular test evidence that I need for a particular feature or a particular function or an operation that I need to do, and how do I test that appropriately by taking the CSA approach. And again, we look at that, and we look at how the CSA guidance as released by the FDA kind of guides people through that. And we'll also bring in elements of GAMP 5 in relation to that, the second edition that's been released. So we look then at the risk-based approach. Again, the FDA is all about risk. Medical devices, pharmaceutical engineering, it's all about risk. It's all about what's the risk associated to the process, to the person, to the patient. What's the risk in relation to that? And we'll talk through that. We'll then talk about the benefits of digital validation for CSA. Again, what we've noticed in the last couple of years, especially unfortunately with the COVID outbreak, is that people were kind of isolated. They couldn't get onto production floors. They couldn't perform some of the validations on site as they used to, again, with the pen and paper approach. So again, what are the benefits to digitizing validation and using the CSA approach in that digital environment. And then we'll have the considerations then for selecting a digital validation tool to implement CSA. Okay, so again, what we need to look at, what are the precautions that we need to look out for? How can we view and look at, is this system that we're going to implement digital validation in suitable for us? And then quickly then we'll go through a case study at the end. The case study was just in relation to a Kneat deployment on a particular customer that we have, just to show you the advantages of using a digital validation tool, and also in particular, the Kneat digital validation tool for this particular customer. So again, let's go straight into it. So computer software assurance. So what are the 5 things that we need to know? Okay, so computer software assurance, it comes from a multi-year collaboration between the FDA and industry that identifies the common pain points, and the FDA's current thinking puts patient safety and product quality at the heart of the risk assessment process. So essentially what happened was the entire industry and the FDA got together and they decided to take a collaborative approach of why is it taking so long to get a product to market? Why is it taking so long to validate something? Why is it taking so long to validate software in particular? It's not a physical thing. It's designed, it's lines of code. It's not something that you can look at and measure. It's just, why was it taking so long? So they looked at it, and these are the 5 things that they decided they need to know. That is, its risk is based on the impact of patient safety and product quality measured against the requirement complexity. So again, if I have a particular feature or a function that the particular software system performs, what is the impact to the patient? What is the impact to the product quality? Because product quality can impact patient safety. So for example, what happens, what's the risk of something going wrong to the patient? Because at the end of the day, the patient is the end user. It's not the manufacturer. The manufacturer does its job manufacturing it. What's the impact to the end user? And we need to look at that then against the requirement complexity. If there are a particularly complex requirement, we should maybe be doing further testing to make sure that requirement is adequately met and verified to be adequately met. So point 2 is that the FDA have always called for the least burdensome approach. In the past, not everybody has taken that into heart. We've taken one process, we have a process, and we do everything, no matter how risky it is, no matter what impact it may have, we always follow the same process. We don't really think before we do. We just act because the process says this is what you do. The process wasn't very enthusiastic about encouraging people to think outside the box to make sure that this actually works, and how can I verify this actually works. Okay, they also looked at it then and said that it can reduce paperwork by 80% with scripted and ad hoc testing. So currently we have scripted testing. Scripted testing, as we all know, is the traditional look and feel of what we have. I have a test instruction. I have an expected result for that test instruction. Have I met that test step? Yes, I have. And I go on to the next test step. So they looked at it, and again, based on risk, is it risky? Is it very risky? Is it not risky? What's the best approach to doing it? And we'll go into unscripted and ad hoc testing later on, but these are concepts that were introduced, and I think they're very appropriate based on what the actual risk of the particular feature or operation will be. And it makes people think about their process more. It results in less issues encountered in production. That's basically the end goal of what we all want to get to. We all want to make sure that we do our computer software assurance cycle, we follow our procedure, we do it on a risk-based approach, and we want to make sure that when it comes to production, we're seeing far less issues that we have. We've all been there in the past, whereby we've taken the traditional approach, we've drafted all the documentation, and we possibly even done 1 or 2 called pilots or dry runs of our test protocols, for example, so IQs or OQs and PQs. The reason we do that is because we don't want to see issues when it's deployed on a particular production, or we don't want the auditor to see that we had an issue during development. And the last part then is that it's FDA and ISPE supported. So again, you're having the regulatory bodies, in this case, which is the FDA and the ISPE, coming together to take a common sense approach. Like, how can we work together to make sure that the regulations are met and a common sense approach is taken based on the risk associated with that feature. The one thing I'd always emphasize here is that the regulations haven't changed. The FDA regulations are still the exact same. It's just a different approach to making sure we still fulfill those regulations. So again, common computer system validation pain points. And for those in the audience who do CSV or validation, I think we can all look at this and kind of appreciate that these are the common ones. So it always generates substantial amounts of documentation. We've all seen mountains of paperwork, mountains of folders, pen and paper, put in cabinets, put away, because we do everything the same. We have a test step, no matter how risky it is, what the impact of that feature is, we always do the same thing. So we generate mountains of documentation. And again, Point number 2, we're doing things for the auditor without thinking. So what does the process say? The process says we do this. Why do we do this? We're only doing this because the process says we do this. We're not really thinking. We're just doing it because the auditor says it and our process says we have to do this. Okay. And number 3 then is test scripts that can run into several pages. I mean, we've all been there when we have a feature that we're a feature or a function of a particular software system that we have to validate, and it can run into 5, 10, multiple pages. And it could be 5, 10 multiple pages for a very particular feature that, say, controls the temperature on a manufacturing piece of equipment, and that temperature is critical to the process. And we can have 5 pages of testing that run into verifying that the help guide works. Little things like that. What's the problem with the help guide? If the help guide doesn't work, okay, it's not going to impact the product quality, it's not going to impact the patient, but we still test it the same way as we would if we had a feature that controls the temperature. That's critical to the process. Again, we're not really thinking, and we're generating pages and pages of documentation for the sake of it. And the 4th one, and every project manager that I've ever worked with and every project manager on the line will know, it takes too long to validate. We give an estimate. This will take X amount of time. We're taking far too long to validate software related to a piece of equipment or a standalone piece of software itself, because we take time to perform dry runs as opposed to testing the system. For example, again, you talk to any auditor in the world, you go to the FDA, dry runs don't exist. We know what they do. We all do dry runs. We're dry running it, so we pick up, a lot of the times we're only picking up typos. So we're picking up typos to make sure that we don't have a deviation, so we can show the auditor how great we are. We had 1 deviation when we did our testing, or even no deviations when we did our formal testing. And the last one then relates to the 4th point. We're addressing test script errors and there's associated time and cost with that. So rather than taking our time, because we only have a finite amount of time to actually generate all the documentation associated with validating a piece of equipment, we're spending a lot of our time looking at the test script rather than looking at the feature or the piece of software that we want to validate. We're spending an awful lot of time on that when we could be using that time elsewhere. And that's some of the common pain points that we see, that stuff, especially say, for example, you make a change on a piece of equipment that's on a production line, that production line the change needs to be implemented as appropriate. It needs to get back online, and we could be delaying it because we're spending time dry running a protocol. That's not particularly a valuable use of time. We should be a better way. Okay. So this brings us on then to the traditional validation approach. Okay. So implementing a software system to drive efficiency and quality improvements, that's what we're really looking at here. So let's look at the traditional way that we do it at the moment, okay? So if we start from the left, we have multiple test cases written for each requirement. So we have our user requirement specification, we have our intended use. So we're going to write multiple test cases for that, right? Which then corresponds to multiple dry runs being done, because I'm going to get this, I have my particular user requirement. I want to make sure the user requirement is tested adequately, but I may not put the step exactly as it should be. Now, again, regardless of how risky it is or not, I'm going to do that, which results in protocol generation errors. Again, am I testing the feature? No, I'm testing the protocol. I'm verifying the protocol works, not verifying the function in some cases, which then comes to, surprise, surprise, 1 formal test execution. So I've done my multiple dry runs. I spent all that time, all that money, all those resources of people generating a document to do 1 formal execution. And surprise, surprise, I found 0 defects. Now, in terms of that, I'm doing a lot of generation of documentation, really, rather than thinking about what's the most important part. And as you can see here, then, if we look to the right, it says critical thinking is not applied, and it's not. And that's the big difference between traditional CSV and CSA. They want you to think, what is important to test, what can impact quality of the product, what can possibly impact the patient. And again, with CSV, every feature is tested the same. So I'll go back to my earlier example. I have my user guide functionality. Brilliant. I'm going to do 5 pages of testing in that. I have a particular feature that controls the temperature on a critical critical process. I'm going to test that the exact same way. I'm going to get all the associated dry runs, all the associated protocol generation errors. Why? What's the benefit? Will it impact the patient? No. Will it impact the quality? No. And again, the arduous documentation approach. And again, we were creating documentation because the auditor wanted to see the documentation. We've all been there. Somebody's called for a particular report or a particular validation on a piece of equipment, and we wheel out 10, 14, 15 folders of documentation. And you can see an auditor's heart just dropping. They have to go through all this. So based on all that, again, there had to be a better way to do this because it wasn't a good use of the resources that were there available to a company. And in terms of, you know, bringing product to market, not really good use of time. So again, let's look at the CSA approach now. So let's see. You can see here, we've completely inverted the triangle. Okay, most of the time now will be spent on critical thinking. Okay, critical thinking, and we'll go through that later on. So again, critical thinking is which we will assess each particular feature, function, or operation on a particular piece of equipment, and we'll determine the appropriate level of test and documentation for that based on its impact to the patient, impact to the product quality. We look at that. We'll then decide our assurance needs on that. We'll have the appropriate testing activities, and we do the documentation. So you can see here, the documentation is lowering with the CSA approach, but the critical thinking is where we want to spend most of our time. That's where a lot of the heavy lifting, where a lot of the initial time is going to be spent. Okay, so you can see here on the left then, we're focusing on the high risk. We're focusing on the high risk features because they're the ones that can impact the quality of impact the patient or impact the product quality. Okay, we're going to spend more time challenging the system rather than generating documentation because that's what the auditor wants to see. We're going to spend more time challenging the system because we have no that time, because we're thinking about what's the best way to use our resources and our testing, which can implementing this can significantly reduce the timeline of bringing of completing the validation or completing the assurance on that particular piece of software. Okay, so you can see here, so we have no detailed test scripts for lower risk features. So again, I'll have high, low, medium risk features, and we go through some of those later on. But again, we're testing at the appropriate level based on the risk of the appropriate feature, operation, or function, which can lead to 60% faster protocol generation and execution. So when I do my dry runs, I'm not really looking at have I spelled something correctly, have I done this, have I done that correctly. I'm looking at my protocol generation and execution. And again, this will lead into value add activities here. I'm using my best. I'm using my resources the best way that I can. Okay, so it will lead to improved quality and efficiency. The intent is the validation effort will be reduced by 30%, and we're spending more time challenging the system. Okay, so applying the new guidance should be, again, a big part of CSA is leveraging the vendor, and we'll go through that in a bit more detail later on. So what has the vendor done? If we're buying in a piece of software or a piece of equipment with software on it, how can we leverage what the vendor has done? We'll be using risk-based evaluation. Again, look at my feature, function, or operation. I'm going to assess each of those and look at the appropriate risk and do the appropriate level of testing, which will lead to streamlined testing. And then based on the intended use of the computerized system, risk should dictate the process of determining the system validation approach. And this risk determination should establish a commensurate level of validation. So again, I'm testing as appropriate based on the risk associated with a particular feature. So from the ISP GAMP5 guidelines here, again, what's critical thinking? So critical thinking is a new concept, and GAMP5 has an entire chapter on this in relation to critical thinking. So I just took some bullet points from here in relation to some good definitions, some good ideas of how we should approach what critical thinking actually is. So again, from the CSP guidelines, second edition, it says, critical thinking promotes informed decision-making and good judgment on where and how to apply and scale quality and compliance activities for computerized systems. Again, I'm thinking, where do I want to put my resources? What do I want to test? How in-depth do I want to test based on the compliance activities for that particular system? So critical thinking should be applied to understand the implementation risks as well as functional risks to patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. Again, I'm looking at these three here now: patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. Now, the CSA guidelines that published from the FDA do not go into a lot of detail about data integrity, but if you think about it, if I'm recording data and if I'm recording my process and if I'm recording that temperature control when I'm actually manufacturing the product, and in 6 months' time I want to go back if there is a product recall and I want to do some investigations onto the temperature when that product was actually manufactured, I will want to make sure that the data is still there, that's recorded, and that data is safe, secure, and hasn't been altered. So, and the last point then is regulators look for scaled paperwork with well-organized information and records that have an appropriate level of detail, supported by clear and unambiguous rationales explaining critical thinking applied. In other words, what we need to do here is that we need to have a process in place to enable our people in our organization to use critical thinking to actually make the correct decisions. Again, go back to the FDA thing, back to the FDA theory. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. If we don't have a process for it and we can't explain to an auditor what that process is that we used, we're really kind of stuck in terms of how we can stand over how we've justified something maybe being a high risk or a low risk or a medium risk. And just again from the GAMP5 guidance, just critical thinking again. Why? So critical thinking should be employed to ensure that the evaluation of the risk to quality should be assessed on scientific knowledge and ultimately linked to the protection of the patient. And the level of effort, formality and documentation of the risk of the quality risk management process should be commensurate with the level of risk. Okay, so again, what they're kind of constantly reinforcing here is that the risk should be based on scientific knowledge. Now, what we'll see here is that in GAMP and as well in kind of in general rule is for all our businesses, we all rely on our subject matter experts, our SMEs. Our SMEs provide vital input when taking the CSA approach. These people are the experts. These people know exactly how the process works, how the process follows, and what we're actually intending to produce as part of this process. So they should be brought in very early in the project, as I think so, to make sure that we get their input in determining the risk of each feature, function, or process step. And the last part of that is, in the context of computerized systems, scientific knowledge is based upon the system specifications and the business process being supported. Again, what's a system specification? What's the business process? What process am I automating? And again, I'm using my SMEs here to make sure that we can actually make sure that the correct approach to our critical thinking and risk assessment is being taken. Okay. And again, what we're doing here is we're applying risk approach to ensure that the software fulfills the validation requirements really of 21 CFR Part 11, sorry, 21 CFR A2070-I, which relates to automated systems. So again, first part of all software systems essentially is somehow we come up with an intended use or kind of a statement of what the intended use is. Again, look at the top one here. We have what, why, who, and when. So what does this particular piece of software do, or this particular software on a piece of equipment do? You know, does it provide equipment control? You know, is it a spreadsheet that has a formula in it that will actually make a pass-fail decision on a batch going out the warehouse? What does it do? You know, for example, does it automatically pass or fail a manufactured item? You know, does it have a visual system that makes sure a pass or fail is done? And the next one then is, you know, what regulations is this particular software intended to ensure is met? You know, do we have to have A20.72 inspection, measuring, and testing equipment, or A2070, you know, automated process, or 21 CFR Part 11? You know, does it have electronic signatures and electronic records? We need to kind of look at those as well when we're defining our system or when we're coming up with our intended use. And most software systems will have some form of a user interface. Again, what form is that user interface going to take? Is it going to be, you know, is it going to be a biometric? Is it going to be a login? You know, is it going to be a push button? Is it going to be a screen involved? So on and so forth. So these are some of the things that we need to take into account in our intended use. The top two again, what, why, who, and when, and the regulations. I'd always keep those two in mind when creating the initial intended use, because the person drafting the intended use may not have the knowledge at the time. Again, the use of your SMEs here is very important to make sure you have the correct people at the correct time to provide the correct input. So let's look at the CSA guidelines then. So the FDA, when they came out with the CSA guidelines, they were very binary. They said you have a high risk feature and a non-high risk feature. Now, they do understand that it's a spectrum. Okay, it is a spectrum of, you know, high risk feature, medium risk feature, low risk feature. You know, and that'll be up to the manufacturer to determine based on the processes that they bring in. But there should be a scientific basis for a high, medium, and low risk. But in the binary kind of approach that the CSA have, they've essentially looked at things like, let's look to the left, a non-high risk feature. So a non-high risk feature could be something that indirectly impacts product quality or human safety. Again, I'm looking here at the product quality, looking here at the human, the end user at the end. And maybe something that's required for regulatory compliance. That could be a non-high risk feature. You know, like you're recording your 21 CFR Part 11 signature. You know, if that doesn't work in the software system, will that really mean that the end product going out to the customer isn't safe? Probably not. It just means that I can't sign off on something, you know, or I can't log in, or so on and so forth. Or I'm recording maybe a slightly incorrect name. But again, that'll be up to the company to what they want to do themselves, you know. So a manufacturer can still determine that a process risk is, for example, you know, moderate, intermediate, or even low. And in such cases as this, the CSA guidance relating to, a not high risk feature would apply. So again, if you're high, medium, or low, if you're moderate, say intermediate, or even low, you'd be looking at the parts of the CSA guidance for not high risk processes. Now, on the other end of the scale here, we have the high risk processes of features of operation. So it directly impacts product quality and human safety, or it could potentially cause a recall. Again, these are things that you want to make sure that are high risk, that they're being tested adequately, that they're being documented adequately. And we go through some examples here about specifically about testing these adequately and how these can be done, sort of approaching a kind of a familiar traditional approach. So yeah, so I go on to the next slide. So again, this is the kind of the CSA approach, the kind of in terms of the testing approach that I'll be talking through later on. So we talked through a while ago about how we actually do risk analysis. So do we do, say, a high risk system or a not high risk system? Okay, so again, the FDA, as I mentioned earlier, looked at things like scripted approaches, unscripted approaches, and ad hoc testing. The intent when they actually looked at this was that we wouldn't follow the traditional CSV approach, which is here, which is essentially scripted testing, which is I have my test step, I complete my action in my test step, and I verify the output of that particular test step. And that's the traditional look and feel of what we've always done, which is the pages and pages and pages and pages of paper. And again, this is how we've traditionally done it. But this really should only be used for items where, say, for example, as I mentioned earlier in the previous slide, features or functions or operations that could impact the product quality or the patient. And again, as you go through your CSA approach and you look at each particular feature, then you'd want to make sure that the high risk features are tested adequately and appropriately. You want to make sure that you have your upper and lower level testing, your challenge testing included in that. And the intent of CSA is that will be essentially 5% of your testing. Now, unscripted testing then essentially is where basically we have a kind of a scenario whereby you don't have an individual test step-by-step approach. You look at the feature, so you don't direct the tester kind of line by line, but you have an overall detail of what you want to test in that step. It's still detailed up front. It's still an approved testing approach. So the particular test scenario that you want to test is approved before it's tested, and that then adequately tests that your not high risk feature is actually working. And the intent is that really goes to 70% of the testing. So you can see there's a drastic change from our traditional approach, which would be step by step, to 70% based on the not high risk feature. And then ad hoc testing here. Ad hoc testing is essentially you're taking the training, the knowledge of the tester and of the SMEs to make sure that they're testing they're testing that particular feature appropriately by using a not prescribed testing step. So essentially what happens is that the tester, based on their knowledge of the system, their knowledge of what can and can't go wrong, again, but only for this particular feature because it's low risk or it's not a risk, they fill out the test steps at the time and they test it as appropriately. And that's all decided when you're actually generating when you're actually using the CSA approach. You indicate which particular features, functions, or operations are tested by which approach, and that should be documented and documented so everyone understands where the testing is actually taking place. Okay, and that's the intent then is that's 25% of your testing. So if I go on here, so again, this is just an example of scripted testing. I think we've all seen something similar to this. This is just a screenshot of the Kneat application here. But again, we're all familiar. You have your individual test ID, a test description, acceptance criteria, some way to go back to your specification reference, essentially what am I testing here? And then you have your test instructions, your expected result, a pass, fail, and a performed by. Again, what are you recording here? You're recording you have your detailed test steps. You may not require screenshots, and you include who performed the test and the date of the test execution. What you notice here is that there is no actual result. Okay, the actual result column, CSA doesn't call for it, GAMP doesn't call for it. The actual result column, it's something that came in but should be gone. I mean, what's the benefit of writing something down? These tests will pass 95, 99% of the time. If you have an issue that occurs as part of a test, have a comment table here, like a comments and a deviations table. You really should only be recording the exceptions rather than the passes. Record the fails rather than everything that happens. And this would be an example of a scripted testing. So if I go here then to unscripted testing, you can see here, the top part here, again, I still have my test ID, test description, acceptance criteria, my response, my reference back to my function that I'm testing. But you can see here, it's a scenario that I'm testing. No, you can call it whatever you want. We just use the example here of scenario. You can see here, it's a statement, verify the work records detailing the results of the work performed against an asset can be created from an assets record. I'm not telling a person step by step how to do it. They're familiar with the system, right? This might be something like for a low risk system, or, why something that's very maybe low risk, and I want to do it this way. So again, each test step has a pass or fail, include who performed the test. And again, it's established by high level objective test plans, and there's no test by step test procedure. So again, this detail here would be approved, and this would be what you'd record at the time of execution. Okay, so again, it's not detailed because the particular feature, function, or operation that we've decided on is that unscripted testing is appropriate for this based on the risk. And the last part then we have is ad hoc testing. So ad hoc testing is essentially, I'll go through this again. Again, the top part here is the same. I'm still going to describe what I'm testing. I'm still going to give you my acceptance criteria. Okay, my scenario here, specification reference there. So you can see here, I haven't put anything in relation to how I expect the tester to verify that that function works. Now, I'm still going to make sure that there is a reference back to that particular function, but I'm going to go on, because it's such a low risk feature. Like, let's look at the example of the user manual. Okay, I'm going to test my user manual here. Do I want to tell my tester to show them how to open the user manual if they're trained on the system, if they're familiar with the system? No, it's not going to give me any benefit. So why should I tell them how to do it? Why even give an unscripted test for that? So you can see here, so there's no pre-approved test steps. Each test still has a pass or fail because you have to verify whether it passed or failed, because you have to make sure you meet the specification reference, meet the requirement. So describe what was tested to verify that the feature worked correctly. And again, you're going to include who performed the test and date of the test execution. So I want to make sure that I have the opportunity to meet all the core principles. In other words, it's attributable, etc., so on and so forth. But I don't really tell the tester what I want to do because this is such low risk in relation to product quality, patient, and possibly even data integrity. I don't want to tell them how to do it. Okay. So what we go on to then is the next part is risk-based validation. So we're going to talk through here. So this is a kind of a summary, really, of what we're kind of talking through at the moment. There's one kind of further slide after this that gives it a bit more information. So to be honest, it's a risk-based approach. Okay, it's not I have a procedure and I follow it blindly. I don't think of what I'm going to do. I have to make sure that it's all risk-based approach, documented, scientifically proven, to make sure that I have the appropriate people at the appropriate time making the appropriate decisions. So you scale the validation activities based on the risk. So is it a not high risk? Is it a not high risk? That's the FDA's view of it, but there is a spectrum that you go across. You could have high, medium, or low. Depending on that, I'm going to use the appropriate scaling activities based on the risk. Okay, I'm going to really leverage vendor audits. Like, we've all had scenarios whereby we take a system from a vendor, we bring it into our organization. Now, we've audited that vendor, right? And that vendor, we're happy with that auditor. They meet all the criteria. They're fully certified to say, ISO 9000. We're really happy that they've done it. And we still come in and we still retest everything. Why do we do that? What's the bonus in that? Again, so we're going to leverage vendor audits. Very important there that we have a strong vendor audit team in place to make sure that they ask the correct questions of the auditor and that they look in the right places to make sure that we're happy that the vendor to us is actually appropriate for what we want to do. And it's all based on system risk and risk-based features. So again, we can break it up into, like, we have an entire software system. Entire software system will contain various features. So let's look at each individual feature and let's see what's the risk on this, what's the risk to the patient, what's the risk to the quality of the product. So let's look at that and do it as appropriate, as opposed to just making a blanket approach, which is not hugely beneficial. Let's test the product rather than test the tester or test the process we have to create all the test documentation or the design documentation, for example. Okay, so coming down here then is unscripted and ad hoc testing. So all functionality is tested, but only high risk functionality requires traditional scripted testing. Now, the reason we look at traditional scripted testing for high risk is because, let's say, for example, you have your limit testing. You want to make sure you test it at the upper limit and the lower limit. You want to make sure that that's tested. So you give a detailed step-by-step guide. You want to make sure you challenge it correctly. you want to make sure that in the scenario where something goes wrong, you have a particular test step that defines what that going wrong is meant to look like. So you want to make sure that it is high risk, because if this feature isn't adequately tested, it could affect the quality of the product, or it could, unfortunately, you know, fingers crossed it doesn't, but impact the patient. And at the end of the day, the patient is the most important part of this whole approach. Again, we want to make sure that we're looking at the risky parts of the system, making sure it's adequately tested. Okay, so we can utilize ad hoc techniques for not high risk features. As I showed earlier, you know, there's the unscripted testing approach, or there's the ad hoc approach. You know, and the ad hoc approach can be used for various ways to do it. Again, it's all based on risk. So again, I'm looking at the user manual. My test for the user manual could be an ad hoc test. You know, open the user manual, verify the user manual is there. Perfect. That's my testing done. The content of the user manual would probably have been verified or reviewed in a previous part of the project or sent on to us by somebody else. They'll make sure the content is correct. We just make sure the functionality to show that is actually there, for example. And then we've, no, just the last thing to make sure of is that unscripted and ad hoc testing does not equal no documentation. You have features and you have functions that you have to make sure, as per the FDA always say, you are ensuring that the system is verified for its intended use. The intended use can be broken down into user requirements, further broken down into features, functions, or operations. You have to make sure that they're verified, that they work as per spec. So again, just because somebody says ad hoc doesn't mean you don't have any actual objective evidence that it's been completed. Okay, and the last one here, then you can see there's the vendor audits. So you scale the level of vendor audit to the risk of the application. If you're bringing in, say, a particularly critical piece of software or a system that is vital for the company and is vital for a process, then you want to make sure that you've done the correct level of audit for that particular product. And you also want to make sure then that you can leverage any information that's provided by the vendor so that you don't have to redo any further testing. So, you know, if you're happy that you've looked through their documentation, you've looked through it and you're happy that the system is validated to your standard, the standard of your company, then do you need to do anything else other than verify that it's been installed correctly? Maybe do some, you know, site acceptance testing, and you're done. Then you can start using the product. So again, scaling the assurance here, we just briefly go through these. So it can really be based on activities, people, and established processes that provide control in production. You know, so we might have something here whereby the system itself has outside controls in terms of, say, people looking at a particular part of the process that may not need to be computerized or may not need to have a particular feature in the software that you might need. Okay, so again, leverage testing by the vendor. So again, established purchasing control process for selecting and monitoring software developers. Let's go in, let's look at these particular, the system that they have. Let's make sure it's appropriate for what we want them to do. And we're going to leverage as much of the information we have from them as they can, including their testing information. So output verification, additional process controls that have been incorporated throughout production. I remember working in the past, we had a scenario whereby we had a computerized system checking the length of a particular product. It then went to the next stage of the production, and a human being did the exact same. So why do we need to have that there? You know, let's look at, is this no, it's in the software, but is it high risk? No, because it's being checked further down the production line. You know, let's look down the production process as well to make sure we're not, you know, to make sure that we're not classifying something as high if it doesn't have to be high. So the last one then is the data and information periodically or continuously collected by the software for the purposes of monitoring or detecting issues and anomalies in the software after implementation. So let's have a look at here at when it's gone into production, how often, is there a tracker to see how often we need to look at this particular piece of software? Is there anomalies popping up all the time? Is it failing? What do we need to do? What do we need to look at? So again, we're scaling here, we're leveraging the other activities. And the last two then are the use of computer system validation tools like bug trackers and automated testing for the assurance of software used in production as part of the quality system whenever possible. Let's look at automating testing. Let's look at code. Let's look at automated code reviews, etc. Let's not go back to the old way of doing eyes on the ground code reviews, etc. And then the use of testing done in iterative cycles and continuously throughout the life cycle of the software used in production, or as part of the quality system. So again, this can be looked at by, agile testing. As you go through the system, you're going to look at the verification activities that you've done. Okay. So again, so we talked through CSA. So let's have a little look now at what are some of the benefits of digital validation for CSA, right? So again, we've been using pen and paper since pen and paper was invented. Let's look at maybe not using pen and paper. So a paperless validation system should automate the validation lifecycle processes, and it should lead to the elimination of inefficiencies. Again, GDP compliance. You know, again, I have a former software quality engineer. Our nickname was the GDP police. We always came back saying you spelled this word wrong in your test step. You know, things like that. Ensuring consistency and compliance, the SOPs and appropriate regs. Again, ensuring all validation software the same approach. You know, using the same version of the approved templates. Ensuring signatures have been obtained prior to execution. You know, stuff like that. We need to make sure that it should lead to that. So the elimination of those sort of issues as well. So cycle time reductions in review and executions. For example, we should have a system, a digital system that allows us to review offline. You know, we can log into this system, we can review our design documentation or test documentation to make sure it's appropriate and approve it thereon. The data integrity, safe and secure storage of generated data. So again, in a true paperless system, you know, screenshots, if you need to take a screenshot, you know, should be integrated into the records for that system. Like if I do need to take a screenshot, in the odd chance that I do, I need to make sure that my data is safe and secure. We have electronic traceability matrix, a reduction in time to generate this artifact. So we've all been there where we've taken hours and hours and hours manually creating a trace matrix. Let's have a look at a system that will automatically generate that trace matrix for us. You know, let's make it easy, let's make it fast. So, apologies. So the integration of the validation and change management process. So again, let's see if we can integrate that in a single system. Let's see if we can have a change request in the same system that we do our validation in. So again, as a part of that, then we have also got cost reductions for printage, storage of generated paper records. It costs an awful lot of money to save records. It costs an awful lot of money to print records. It's expensive, and when we need to get them back, it takes time to get them back. Right? It's just quite an expensive process. So you get the increase in quality as well in relation to that. So again, less chance of ad hoc additions to electronic-based systems. You know, for example, we've all seen notes to file to a document to explain an issue found during the validation. You know, so we've all seen things like that. So let's look at it in terms of increasing the quality, and that's one of the benefits of digital validation, digital approach, and scalability. You know, scalability of the system in order to add new software systems or sites, etc. So again, if we have a software system that's installed, should we be able to scale it out to another site or bring in another process? That's another benefit of digital validation. You bring in the new process into that system and you quite simply add it. And the one thing that's very, very important that we look at is instant access to validation artifacts in the event of an audit. Again, we've all been there whereby somebody asks us for a validation that was done 6, 12, 18 months ago. We've got to go out, we've got to put in a request form to get that particular piece of documentation. This has to go to somebody else to be signed. It then goes out, we get it, we get it taken from the storage area, we get it brought back in. You know, there's a cost associated with that, and there's a timeline associated with that as well. For example, if you're looking through evidence that you need to look at for a CAPA or in terms of a product recall, you know, it can take time to get that information. You know, electronic system will have it there instantaneously when you want it. Okay, so what we'll talk about now is just some considerations. So this is kind of the what you want your digital validation system to do for you. But let's look at some of the considerations when you're selecting a paperless validation system. So again, it should be a purpose-built enterprise data management solutions for life sciences that, again, you select the system that is that is process-centric, not tool-centric. So it should take your process and it should digitize it. You shouldn't have it the other way around. You shouldn't be looking at a tool that says you have to change a process. Okay, again, that's the ideal situation. So is it 21 Part 11 compliant? Is it password protected? Does it have electronic signatures? Does it have a time-stamped audit trail? You know, you need to make sure that that's there because that's what will be looked for. You want to select a functional, user-friendly system that fits the company culture and that supports the full process, including central management, retrieval, and viewing of records. You want something that's easy to use. You don't want something that's hugely complex. You want something that enables the transition from a paper system to an electronic system without a massive shock to those who have to use it. So the adaptability for future business needs for example, configurability. Like when I bring in my digital validation system, is it just for this site? When I want to bring on another site, do I need to go through another huge project to bring it back in, or can I just expand it? And again, we have a traditional look and feel, the system that should still be document centric, but with strong data management capabilities. I want to make sure that I can get the data, like how many documents are open, is this particular test document completed yet? How can I tell that? Can I log in? Can I see it easily enough? And how mobile is it, which is the main thing for me, to be honest. Can it be used on both laptops and tablets? Can I only log on to it if I'm at my particular site? If I'm on the train, or if I'm at home, can I log in and approve documents and approve test documents, or even execute test steps if I'm working on a software only system? And the last one is, how secure is my data? This is your data. It's vital. Your data is very important. For example, is the vendor compliant with ISO 27001 information security and management systems? Again, you want to make sure that it's your data, it's available to you, and it's secure. So what we'll just do is we'll just go into some case studies of a specific CSV process that was actually implemented via the Kneat application. So, sorry, next one. So just briefly introduce Kneat at the moment. So why do 8 of the world's top 10 life science companies use Kneat? Again, I work for Kneat, so again, I'm just going to go through some of the case study on this. So, So it's one platform and it's any work process. So it's not just CSV, it's CQV, cleaning. Again, you can bring in any process. It eliminates 100% of paper from the validation lifecycle. Cost. That's going to cost you. It's proven to reduce cycle times and skilled labor hours and validation costs. It's proven to increase right first time and speed to market. It's easy to use, to train, and to scale to. It's audit ready at any time. I can access any records that I want instantaneously when I want them. It automatically enforces data integrity. It automatically makes sure that you can't do a GDP, you can't incorrectly sign for something, for example. And it has paperless test execution, including on-site with smart devices. In other words, I can access it from a laptop, from a mobile device, for example. I can use all of those. So this is why 8 of the top 10 life sciences companies are currently using Kneat and have deployed Kneat. So let's look at some of the customer results using Kneat. So again, it reduces equipment changeover time by much as 85%, and that was found in the following independent customer benchmarking study and used for Kneat commissioning and qualification for equipment validation. It reduces validation lifecycle time by over 50%, as found by multiple independent customer benchmarking studies, and it's used for commissioning and qualification. It reduces labor hours and cost by 50 to 65%, and again, that was found in an independent partner benchmarking study. And in one of them, it saved $0.81 million in ERP deployment, and again, found in the following independent partner benchmarking used for Kneat system. So essentially, you're using a system that's been digitized, such as Kneat, and especially in this case study, Kneat. You can see the benefits are there straight away in terms of you're making sure that it's faster and quicker to get what you need done. So it's 65% fewer validation laborers and a 46% in fewer process steps, which leads to an overall 40% more efficient than the leading competitor that we currently have. So we just go on to the next study here. Let's go on to the study itself, which is Fuji Rebio. So, and this was enabling to deploy their CSV process in Kneat. Overall, in terms of this, it resulted in a 53% cycle reduction time for change control, 40% fewer hours for script execution, and 100% remote validation. So let's keep in mind COVID, let's keep in mind people may not be on site, they might be traveling, they may still want to do the work when they're traveling. If I'm away from the office or if I'm away from my particular network, I can still log in and do my particular job that I need to do if I've deployed Kneat to my site. So the challenges and opportunities that this company saw at that particular time is seeing the opportunity to streamline CSV to underpin rapid growth and manage data integrity proficiently. Fuji Rebio sought to find and implement a validation solution that could digitize and enable management of validation process on one platform, delivering efficiency and full platform. So at the time, prior to the installation of Kneat, this company, Fuji Rebio, were using a hybrid approach. They had some paper process, some with an off-the-shelf process as well. So they have a hybrid mix of off-the-shelf system, which is not ideal because it's better to have a one-size-fits-all solution that will do everything that you want. So this resulted in a range of challenges and opportunities for them for, numbering the documentation, generating and approving documents across systems and sites, collecting review comments if you have a hybrid approach, approve, via multiple pathways, manual workflows between author and reviewers and approvers. I mean, in the past, I've gone around to people's desk because, you drop your paper in front of them saying, can review and sign this, and you have your desk is piled high with paper. So seeing the opportunities for this, they looked at a possible system that could provide a full e-validation system for them. And the system that they eventually went with was Kneat. Okay, and just some details on what they required from their IT manager was that the requirements that the vendor had at the time was that, from Catherine Ross, I wanted an overall increase in compliance and traceability between requirements identified for a system and the testing that was done to prove they had met them, and full enforcement and display of good documentation practices as if scripts were executed on paper. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to digitize your system. Let's make the easiest way to go to the next level in terms of going from paper to e-validation is make it similar, because people are familiar with pen and paper. So if you make your system very familiar with paper, it makes the move, and in terms of wanting people to make the move, a little bit easier. So that's what they wanted at the time. And that's one of the reasons that they picked Kneat, because Kneat, very similar system. It's very similar to the look and feel of executing and designing documentation on paper. So again, from the Catherine Ross, the manager of IT compliance, with automated software, there's a lot of overhead because you're basically scripting. You need to have a sort of programming level skill to understand how to script at a company like theirs with so many different types of systems. There are many different types of programs to maintain test data sets. When we go to validate, we try to clone our production databases back to dev, if a dev or val, for example. So now we're doing our test execution for change control. We're working with a copy of the real data. Well, if you're changing your data every year, then your scripting changes. The record ID you may have previously used is no longer there, and the value of certain fields has changed. So you really have to get the whole team to do it. It's very costly. So one of the reasons that this company went with Kneat is because it had the same traditional look and feel of working with paper. So this was one of the items that they looked at that they didn't want to have to deal with when they deployed their digital validation solution. So with the implementation of implementing Kneat in this particular company, so from initial consultation, go live implementation was completed within 6 months. Okay, it covered all key implementation phases, including process mapping, system configuration, training, and deployment. So that's taking your process, digitizing your process, configuring your system, and training and deploying your system in a 6-month period, which is quite a quick turnaround in terms of when you think of how long it probably initially took it to decide your process to now digitize it. So in October of 2022, Fuji Rebio Diagnostics and Kneat completed implementation to the project's lead US site, going live at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. So once implemented, Kneat instantly enabled FDI's computer system validation process, including execution of all test scripts, to be performed 100% remotely. So that's a huge change from our traditional pen and paper. Could you imagine if you were working from home and you had a pen and paper post and you had to sign something? You would be posting and, putting stuff in UPS and constantly sending it out, which is not a huge use. It's not an appropriate use or smart use of the money that you have to do a project. Okay. So the results and the experience that they have, so the Fuji Rebio Diagnostics Incorporated, they achieved a 53% reduction in time for quality management for CAPA system change control projects. It reduced the number of working days for script execution from 15 to just 7 on average, and eliminated reliance on time-consuming hybrid validation systems and driving the efficiencies in the validation team. So you can see here that it enabled a 53% cycle time reduction for change control, 40% fewer hours for script execution, and 100% remote validation. The one thing that I found with Kneat is that, again, as a former software quality engineer, is the reviews take a hell of a lot faster. You're not looking out for GDP errors. You're looking at the evidence. You're looking at what was done rather than testing the tester. Did the tester do it right? Not did the tester do it right? Did they record it right? That's what you're looking at. You're looking at what they've done, and you're looking at it, to my mind, correctly and a bit more in depth. So again, that's one of the benefits of using Kneat. It has a traditional look and feel of your paper-based process. Again, Kneat will take your process, it'll digitize it. As I mentioned earlier, one of the characteristics you should be looking for with a tool to digitize your system is it should map your process, not the other way around. So thank you very much for your attendance. If you have any questions, please now is the time to ask. But again, if you have questions that you'd like to submit, and we can examine those questions later on, and we could get back to you with any particular answers that you have. I hope you found it instructive. It is quite a lot to take in. The key takeaways I take from the CSA approach is that common sense has prevailed with the regulatory bodies and with the manufacturers themselves. I mean, CSA has looked at what's the risk, where should we be spending our time and money, where should we be spending our people, what should they be doing that make sure that a safe and quality product goes to the customer. So if there's any questions, please ask now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Darren. And we do have a number of questions. We won't be able to get to them in the kind of final 3 minutes, but we'll start. And like I said, we'll follow up directly with the ones we don't get to. The first one here is around, you mentioned that CSA is ISPE supported. Does this refer to GAMP5? And in which case, in your opinion, what is the applicability of CSA to pharma GXP system validation? As it almost seems like it's only applied to medical device validation right now.
I think it is based on GAMP5, and GAMP5 has an entire chapter on CSA. I think they equally apply. I've worked in areas whereby I've looked at the pharma side of things and the medical device side of things. I think they equally apply to both. Again, okay. I will go back to the point that you're looking at the particular risk associated with that operation function or feature. The process is the process, and you look at it from that perspective of how you assess it and test it and verify it appropriately.
Perfect. Thank you. Leveraging on the supplier can sometimes be a challenge and often requires an audit, which then obviously comes with a cost. Risk-based approach could suggest questionnaire or mail assessment, but do you think it provides sufficient discernment about the quality of the internal testing and documentation?
Again, it can, right? Let's say, for example, you want your vendor, you're going to a vendor, and you've got a low risk process. Okay, so you've got a low risk process that you're implementing now as part of a computer system, right? A desktop audit might be sufficient for that because it's low risk. Again, what's the worst that can happen to the patient? What's the worst that can happen to the quality of the product? You know, exactly. Think about it that way. But let's say, for example, I have a vendor, and if something goes wrong with the product that we buy from them, and it could impact the product or could impact the quality, I would have a far more intense audit on them. I would nearly go through their objective evidence. I mean, I would look at the evidence that they have actually given me. I would look into that to make sure that, okay, I've identified this feature because, again, I've given the vendor my intended use. I've told them what I want. Okay, if I'm looking at this feature or this part of the process, okay, your particular piece of software, your particular piece of equipment implements this feature. Okay, this is a high risk feature. I'm going to follow all the way down to make sure that's tested appropriately. So it depends on what you're getting in the system for. Okay. And the higher the risk, the deeper the audit, the deeper you'd go.
Perfect. Thank you for that guidance. I do want to be cognizant of time. There are, like I said, a number of questions. We will follow up with you directly. One of the couple of questions that are similar is regarding a copy of the slides. So yes, today's program was recorded, and you will get an email early next week. It will have a copy of the slides as well as the recording. So you can expect to see that in your inbox next week. I want to thank everyone on the line that joined us today. We really appreciate you coming out to our webinars and hope you found them interesting and insightful. Darren, thank you again for preparing this presentation and sharing your subject matter expertise with the audience. I'm sure we will do another one of these in the future. And so thanks everyone for your time, and we look forward to seeing you on the next Kneat webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye now.